Thank you, everybody. Just have to work out this. I'm going to talk about this project that we're doing with VicPol and the AFP. It's a 5-year project, as David mentioned, and I've got 15 minutes to tell you about a 5-year project. So what I'd like to do is actually give you an idea of the scope of the project, so the bigger picture, what it is that the whole project is about. I'll do that in the first half of the talk. And then go into one of the sub-projects, because when we've got this very large project, what we've divided up into lots and lots of different sub-projects. So give you a bit of the scope and then a sense of how we're going deeper into one of the particular areas in this. I can probably just start. I'm just trying to remember what's on the next slide, but I can at least just have a start. I think we're really excited about this project, and I'm pleased to be talking about it today because one of the instigations for the project is that if you look at research in forensic science, up until a few years ago, most of the research in forensic science was done by scientists on the sciences, and there was this kind of assumption that if we improve the science, then everything will be more effective. So we just make the science better. Whereas, in fact, we're now sort of playing in this space and saying there's a whole range of issues for social scientists and criminologists, really looking at how it fits into the criminal justice system. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking. So what I wanted to do is just give you an overview, as I said, of the project. I'm going to go through the slides very quickly because you can read them more quickly than I can speak to them, and some of them I'll speak to in a bit more detail. So the project is a 5-year project. The industry partners are Victoria Police, Australian Federal Police, Forensic Data Centres and the National Institute of Forensic Science. We've got a number of universities collaborating. It's based at UTAS, but there are a number of universities involved, including the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And we've had a lot of interest internationally from the NPIA, from the NIJ in this particular project. We've got a multidisciplinary team, and that's an important part when you're talking about forensic science and the criminal justice system. So we've got sociologists, economists, forensic scientists all working together. The person who does most of the work, as usual, is the postdoc fellow. So I'll just mention Sally Kelty. She may, in fact, have spoken to some of you. She's the one that goes around the country and actually collects the data and does the real work. And we've got partner investigators, obviously, from our particular industry partners. And we've got 3 PhD candidates that are variously attached to this project. And I will mention a bit later the work that those 3 students are doing. One's from law, one's from forensic science, and one is a practitioner, forensic chemist at McLeod at VicPol. So the rationale, as I mentioned before, is really that there's a sense in which people talk about forensic science as revolutionising law enforcement, particularly DNA, but there's actually not a lot of evidence. There isn't an evidence base to that assumption. There hasn't been a lot of research, outside scientific research, to look at how forensic science actually impacts on police investigations, on court outcomes. How is it measured? How can we actually look at that? I now know, after a few years of work in this area, why they don't do that, because it's too hard to measure, but we're working on it, so we're working through that. So the research is really looking at that, looking at ways in which to look at the effectiveness of forensic science in order to provide advice in deploying resources in the best places in policing and in criminal investigations. So the aims of the project are fourfold. Firstly, to identify the processes and variables that contribute to the effectiveness of forensic science. And that has involved really mapping out the processes involved and what goes on in the collection of forensic evidence, the analysis of forensic evidence, how it's involved in criminal investigation, how it gets to court, what are the court outcomes. To then quantify the outcomes of those processes. So we're doing some quantitative analysis that involves linking the databases between the Forensic Science Centre and the police database and the court outcomes. And also then looking at an economic analysis of those processes in order to provide some advice around resource allocation, and then to develop an evidence-based practice model to assist police in that process. So as you can see, it's a very large scope. The methodology in the beginning was very exploratory, to have a look at what is effective, how would we measure effectiveness, what does it mean, and it actually means different things in different phases of the criminal justice system. We've been using qualitative methods as well as quantitative ones. interviews, looking at case studies. Very early on we decided the project would focus on serious crime. We've got one aspect of the project that's looking at forensic intelligence, which is looking at volume crime, but majority of the work we're doing is around serious crime, in particular homicide and arson. And we're obviously doing the quantitative data analysis that I mentioned before. So this is the way we've conceptualised AIM 1, which is looking at the process and the way in which forensic evidence is collected, used, applied, and what are the outcomes in the criminal justice system. Focusing on the crime scene to begin with, how it's collected at crime scenes, how that forensic evidence moves through into the forensic laboratories and how it gets analysed, how the results of that analysis then impact on police investigations, criminal investigations, and the preparation of brief into the court, and then how that's involved in courts and court outcomes. We've also, as I said, got a PhD student at UTS who's looking at the way in which forensic evidence is used for intelligence purposes, not just in terms of the processes that are driven by court outcomes. So looking at various ways in which forensics can be used by police organisations. We have a PhD student from law who's looking at the far end of that continuum. So she's looking at the way in which lawyers understand DNA evidence, who they talk to, and how that's then affects the way in which they conduct their court cases. And as I mentioned, Pete Woodman at McLeod is doing a quantitative analysis of the data, looking at the process through that. So I can't go into all of those sub-projects, but if we look at AIM 1, which is trying to map out these, what we've been doing is mapping out in a lot more detail that process both for homicide and for arson, and then using case studies to look at where were the processes effective, where were they not effective, what were the resourcing implications of ineffective allocation of time and investigation and forensic evidence. And in that process then we've been looking at what are the critical points along that continuum that impact on whether forensics evidence or forensic science is used effectively or not. And there are a whole lot that we've been delving into, and again I can't go into those. But there are aspects of the crime scene that can be improved. There are aspects of the crime scene that need to be understood better to make it more effective. There's processes at the labs that are important to look at around backlogs and how evidence is triaged and the costs of particular different disciplines within the labs. The way in which the sciences themselves may be reliable or not, and therefore whether they should be admitted in court. The way in which forensic evidence is involved in criminal investigations, whether it's timely advice to detectives, whether it's relevant advice, what is the interaction between detectives and forensic scientists, and so on. So we've been mapping out what all those processes are and using case studies predominantly to focus on what goes wrong, what goes well, and how can we build in what goes well into a best practice model.